Breaking news in New York, the CEO of UnitedHealthcare was shot and killed by a masked man near a Midtown Manhattan hotel early this morning. The shooting appears to be targeted, but police do not know why. Brian Thompson was shot this morning outside the New York Hilton on 6th Avenue. He wasn't staying at that hotel. Thompson was in New York City for an investors conference, and his schedule was widely known.
In the early morning of December 4th, 2024, Midtown Manhattan was already awake in the way only New York can be awake. Traffic moving between steel towers, early workers stepping into cafes, hotel staff preparing for another day of conferences and check-ins at the New York Hilton Midtown. It was the kind of morning that felt routine, controlled, almost predictable in its rhythm. Then, outside the entrance of that hotel, everything shifted. A man walking toward the building, Brian Thompson, the chief executive officer of UnitedHealthcare, one of the most powerful figures in the American health insurance industry, was suddenly struck by gunfire in broad daylight. The shots came quickly, breaking through the normal flow of the city with a force that made people stop mid-step, unsure of what they had just heard or seen. In a city that never stops moving, something stopped everything for just a few seconds. There was no warning that anyone nearby could clearly recognize in the moment. No public confrontation, no visible struggle before it happened. Just an immediate eruption of violence outside one of Manhattan's busiest hotel corridors, where business leaders and visitors were arriving for a major corporate gathering. And then came the details that would later deepen the confusion. The shooter did not simply flee without leaving a trace of intent behind. On the spent cartridge cases recovered at the scene, words have been written. 3 words that investigators would later confirm and repeatedly reference as they try to understand what led to that moment. At first, there was no explanation that made sense of it. No immediate answer to why a healthcare executive, a figure tied to one of the largest insurance companies in the United States, would be targeted in such a deliberate and public way. The identity of the person responsible was unknown. The motive was unclear. Even the methodical nature of the act raised more questions than answers. What remained in those first moments was uncertainty layered over shock. A high-profile figure had been attacked outside a major Manhattan hotel, and the person responsible had already disappeared into the city's early morning crowd. And as the investigation began to unfold, one question would continue to surface again and again in those first hours. Who would plan something like this? And why would the message be written so clearly where everyone could eventually find it? Midtown Manhattan in early December carries a very specific kind of energy. The air is cold, sharp enough that it pushes people to walk a little faster. But the streets are never still. Cars move in steady lines between towering buildings. Office workers fill sidewalks with brief conversations and hurried steps. And hotel staff prepare for the constant rotation of guests that defines the city's business district. At the center of that movement stood the New York Hilton Midtown, a landmark hotel known for hosting large corporate gatherings, conferences, and investor meetings. On this particular morning, it was not just another hotel. It was the site of an annual investor meeting for one of the largest healthcare companies in the United States, drawing executives, staff, and stakeholders into a tightly scheduled day of discussions and presentations. Among those expected inside that building was Brian Thompson, the chief executive officer of UnitedHealthcare, a man who had spent years rising through the ranks of the company, eventually leading an insurance system that touched tens of millions of lives across the country. Under his leadership, UnitedHealthcare had become a central force in American healthcare coverage, generating enormous revenue while also standing at the center of growing public criticism. Because outside the corporate success, there had been an ongoing tension building around the very industry represented. UnitedHealthcare, like other major insurers, had faced repeated scrutiny over claim denials, prior authorization delays, and decisions that left many patients frustrated with a system they felt was increasingly difficult to navigate. Those criticisms were not quiet anymore. They had become part of a wider national conversation about healthcare access, cost, and corporate responsibility. For Thompson personally, the pressure was not only institutional. Reports had surfaced that he had received threats connected to disputes over insurance coverage decisions. It added another layer of unease around a role that was already under public attention. Still, he continued to operate at the highest level of corporate leadership, moving between meetings, investor presentations, and executive responsibilities that carried both influence and controversy. On December 4th, 2024, that routine brought him to Midtown Manhattan for the investor meeting at the Hilton. The morning outside the hotel looked like any other business day in New York. People arriving early, security presence around the entrance, and executives moving through the doors with purpose. But beneath that surface of order, there was an atmosphere shaped by something less visible. The weight of public debate surrounding healthcare in the United States had been growing for years, and figures like Thompson often found themselves at the center of that tension, whether directly or indirectly. That morning, he stepped into a space that represented both power and scrutiny, a corporate gathering inside one of Manhattan's busiest business hotels. However, the federal case remained active, ensuring that the legal process continued on multiple fronts. At one point, discussions surrounding the potential application of the death penalty emerged within the federal framework. But those considerations were later constrained by court rulings and procedural limits as the case developed. As of the latest available updates, the proceedings remain ongoing. Evidence continues to be examined, motions are still being filed, and both sides are preparing for further stages of litigation. The case has not reached its final resolution, and the courtroom process continues to define its next chapter. Beyond the courtroom, the case continued to echo through public discussion, taking on a significance that extended far past the events of December 4th, 2024. For many observers, the killing of Brian Thompson became tied to broader frustrations with the American healthcare system. The details presented in court and through investigation were repeatedly referenced in conversations about insurance practices, claim denials, and the role of large corporations in determining access to medical care. The case also raised difficult questions about how society interprets violence when it is connected to ideological grievances. Public reactions revealed a clear divide, with some emphasizing the absolute nature of criminal responsibility, while others focused on the conditions and frustrations that were being discussed in the aftermath. This divide was especially visible across generations, where differing perspectives on institutions' authority and protest shaped how the case was understood. What one group saw as an unacceptable act of violence, another interpreted as a reflection of deeper systemic issues. As time passed, the incident began to function as a reference point in wider national conversations. It was cited in discussions about inequality, healthcare access, and corporate influence, becoming more than a single criminal case. Even as legal proceedings continued, the broader impact remained active in public discourse, ensuring that the events in Midtown Manhattan were not only remembered for what happened that morning, but also for the questions they left behind. In the end, the case was not defined only by the shooting that took place outside a Midtown Manhattan hotel. It was also defined by the reaction that followed in the days, weeks, and months after December 4th, 2024. What unfolded was not contained within a single investigation file or courtroom proceeding. It became a moment where public anger, grief, and division converged around one event, each perspective pulling the narrative in a different direction. The facts of the case remained fixed in time, but the meaning assigned to them continued to shift in public discussion. And even as legal proceedings moved forward, one question lingered in the broader conversation. What does it say about a country when a single case can divide opinions so sharply and so widely at the same time? In the end, it wasn't just a shooting that shocked America. It was the reaction that followed. If you found this documentary breakdown meaningful, like, comment, and subscribe for more in-depth true crime storytelling.